Hi, welcome to Session 7 of Pirate Smugglers and the Making of the Modern World. Today we're going to diverge from what we've been doing over the last few weeks. Up until recently we've been going through examples of classic ages of piracy in the Mediterranean, in the Spanish Main, in the South China Sea, and sort of looking at a narrative of pirate activities and examining causation. Why did piracy occur? What was done to suppress it? And addressing those kinds of issues. But today we're going to take a different tack. We're going to look at the social history of pirates. And that means we want to try to get a look at what is the society of pirates? What is it like as a community? What kinds of values do these people have? What is the role of issues like violence? In fact, this is the tape. You may not want to be eating anything when we get to violence. We discuss some various aspects of violence, both in the larger society, but also within pirate society itself. We've talked about a couple of women pirates, but we haven't really talked about women as pirates. Where did they fit in pirate society? And we certainly didn't get into much detail. We're going to look more closely at several of these women today and their role in the pirate community. The role of blacks in the pirate community, the role of homosexuals in the pirate community. All of these groups helped compose a very complex social organization, and we want to look at it from a variety of perspectives. And at the same time, we are going to draw upon some individual examples, as we've done in looking at specific pirate activity. But what we're trying to get at, even with the examples, is what is the larger picture as we look at pirates as a group of human beings, as social interactors. What kinds of values do they have? What kind of society do they have? And also help explain, in the end, perhaps, why these types of societies, at least those that prevailed in the 17th, 18th, and early 19th century, disappeared very rapidly, aside from the fact that, yes, they were under attack by various centralized governmental institutions. What was it about their own society, perhaps, that caused their disappearance as significant social entities by the end of the early 19th century? So these are some of the issues we're going to look at today. To begin with, we want to talk about the sources of pirates, and we mentioned a little bit of this in the very first session about why do we have pirates, where do these people come from, who are they? And in that regard, we know that the vast majority of pirates were able-bodied seamen who had already been employed either in naval vessels or merchant vessels, and through one method or another, either through voluntary decision on their part or because they were captured by pirates, eventually entered into a pirate society and piratical activity. Now, the question is, why would they do that? And part of the answer that I've suggested before, and is very accurate, is that life as an able-bodied seaman in either merchant or naval activities, certainly in the 17th and 18th centuries, was a miserable, rotten life. And people would gladly take an opportunity, if possible, at least most of them would, despite the dangers of being executed, to engage in pirate activity rather than face a continuing life as a seaman on a merchant vessel or in a naval vessel. Reasons for this are multiple. First of all, as it was, even if you weren't a pirate, simply being a seaman on a vessel in the 17th, 18th centuries was an extremely dangerous occupation in terms of the survivability of ships in storms, in terms of the dangers of losing your life simply working on a vessel. Having to climb the rigging, falling off the rigging, tended to be a terminal accident. So life in general on these vessels was extremely dangerous. If necessary, why not choose perhaps an equally dangerous life as a pirate, but one that might be more rewarding? Other issues that affected the life of the average seaman: diet. Food was terrible on naval vessels and merchant vessels, probably worse on merchant vessels in most cases. But in any case, generally the diet that seamen faced on a day-to-day basis consisted of some small portions of meat, usually like pork or beef, perhaps some type of gruel that was made up, and then, of course, the infamous sea biscuit. Sea biscuits were often the staple of the diet, and these things were hard as rocks because, of course, they were left on the vessels for weeks, months at a time. By the time you got to eat some of them, you usually had to pour water on them to soften them, and then of course the maggots crawled out of the biscuit that it crawled in there when it was first fresh and edible. So the food wasn't very good. Disease was a real danger, particularly the disease of scurvy. Scurvy results from a lack of vitamin C in the diet, and particularly, obviously, the lack of citrus fruit would be a particular reason for it. It's really not until 1795 that the British Navy will require that all of its vessels carry on board either lime juice or actual limes, thus the term limey in referring to British seamen in later periods. It wasn't until then, nearly the end of the 18th century, that the Royal Navy was doing this, and it was well into the 18th century before people realized what the cause of scurvy was. And the symptoms, of course, were rather gruesome, because what happens with the lack of vitamin C in your diet is the collagen in your body breaks down, and collagen is like a paste that holds your body tissue together, holds the dentin in your teeth together, and if it starts to disappear, one thing that happens is the blood capillaries, little vessels in your body, the blood vessels start to break down. You start to hemorrhage, and you start getting little splotches around the roots of your hairs on your body, and you realize that this is, well, that's the indication you're starting to get scurvy and you're starting to die. The other thing is that your teeth start to break down because the dentin is disappearing in them, so you get loose teeth or they fall out. It becomes a little difficult to eat. You can imagine taking on a hard sea biscuit when you're suffering from scurvy. And this was a common disease, and again, its treatment was not widespread until the late 18th century. So it was very common for seamen to be suffering from this disease. The longer the voyage, the greater likelihood that they would suffer from it, because the longer they would be deprived of citrus fruits and vitamin C. Now, beyond that immediate sort of sea-specific disease, both in terms of sea life and vitamin C, tropical disease is very common. A considerable portion of the Navy and merchant vessels are, of course, sailing to Africa, sailing to the southern portions of Asia, sailing into the Spanish Main, where you have high temperatures and high humidity. Dysentery, a disease whose symptoms we'll leave aside for now. Dysentery was a fairly common disease, as were other diseases that tended to flourish, particularly bacterially based diseases that tended to flourish in hot tropical climates. So chances were good on a voyage to Africa or to the Spanish Main that a typical ship might lose a third of its crew or more to disease. So your life expectancy as a regular seaman was not that great. Aside from lousy diet, the real danger of death from disease, and of course rotten living conditions and working conditions, because you sleep below decks. The ship is always damp and wet. It's crawling with bugs because they thrive, cockroaches, etc., thrive in the damp climate. And I mean damp climate. It doesn't make any difference whether you're sailing in the North Sea or the South Pacific. The ship is damp because water is seeping in inevitably into the timbers of the ship itself. So you're constantly faced with the problems of damp living conditions and insects that are crawling over you day and night because they're endemic throughout the sailing vessels of this time period. Beyond all of these conditions, there's also the problem of seasonal employment. This is not a year-round business for most of the merchant fleet in particular. Naval vessels, we see a somewhat different situation. But in general, for merchant vessels, they can't go sailing, or few of them will sail during the winter months. The dangers increase dramatically in terms of stormy weather. And of course, we're talking here mostly about Europeans, but also in Asia as well. The winter brings extremely stormy and dangerous weather. Therefore, merchants are not going to risk their vessels out on the high seas during these months. So the vessel pull into port for the winter, and you're out of a job. And there is no unemployment. This is the 17th, 18th century. There is no unemployment. There are no social welfare benefits. So you have to make do as best you can. So most of the able-bodied seamen of the world are unemployed for a significant portion of every year, and therefore most of them are, generally speaking, desperately poor because they only have a part-time income. Somewhat different conditions apply to the Navy. And the Navy, too, was loath to put its ships out to sea during winter months. But the larger shift in employment in the Navy came from periods of peace versus war. During wartime, of course, there was a vast mobilization. People were pressed into the naval fleet. But then when peace came, there would be a mass demobilization, and thousands, if not tens of thousands, of seamen would be dismissed from the Navy because they were no longer needed. The example I give you here obviously comes at the end of the War of the Spanish Succession that we were talking about earlier in a previous session. Here we have 49,860 men in the British Navy in 1713, just before the war ends. And then when the war is over, you get to 1715, and that's down to under 14,000, 13,475. So you've had this dramatic drop. Tens of thousands of men have been put out of work by this demobilization in the Royal Navy. And this was happening, of course, periodically throughout the 17th and 18th centuries as wars raged and then subsided in Europe. So even if you're in the Navy, you don't have any guarantee of long-term employment. You're likely to be thrown out on your ear as soon as you're victorious. You'll have to go back home and look for another job. If all of this wasn't bad enough for the average seaman, the average working person on a merchant or naval vessel, there was also the issue of the captain's cruelty. Although naval captains, of course, we assume have absolute authority on their vessels, this was also true at this time of merchant captains. They too were considered to have absolute authority, and they would use it. And it was not unusual to have a highly abusive captain. In fact, what we would take today to be essentially monstrous behavior by an employer of any kind was considered fairly common. Let us say you're a seaman working on the deck and you've been warned once before that you're not working hard enough, you're not swabbing the deck fast enough. The captain or the first mate may come over and belt you in the face and knock you to the ground. And that's not considered unusual. I mean, that's obviously didn't get the message first time, so the second time we used the 2x4 as a reminder to get your attention. This kind of treatment was normal. And of course, for more serious offenses, for someone who had actually been caught, let us say, stealing something or was engaged in fights commonly with his crewmates, there was always flogging. And flogging was usually the most popular kind of punishment, where they'd pull your shirt off, lash you to the mast, and then deliver a certain number of lashes on top of that, 5, 10, 15, 20, depending upon what the captain felt was appropriate for your misbehavior. So there was a good deal of violence that came from captains down into the crew in terms of punishment and in terms of general treatment. Again, even if you look at the Navy, this is not a Navy of volunteers, people anxiously going out to serve their country. Most of these people have been dragged off the country roads of England or Spain or whoever Navy it is and forced into the Navy. And of course, they're treated accordingly as if they were prisoners more than as if they were sailors serving in the National Navy. And so their treatment as well is equally brutal. Generally, between the lash and the fact that you're impressed, most sailors on these vessels were there because they were forced to be, either literally because they were forced by a press gang or because they really had no other option. I mean, their survival depended upon them going out to sea because that's the only way they could earn a living, and therefore they had to endure this punishment. Obviously, none of these people are going to be terribly anxious to stay in this way of life if there is an alternative. But they know, for most of them at least, the only alternative they have at the moment is being a sailor in a merchant vessel or a naval vessel, and if not that, unemployment at home. The one other option that stands out over time is to be a pirate. You can use your naval skills, but perhaps live in an environment, well, hardly pristine or ideal by our standards of the 20th century, or the 21st century, is nevertheless far better than what you're enduring in the regular maritime or naval service. To begin with, pirates, as a rule, although not always, we've seen cases like Francis Drake and others who essentially were appointed to their positions, privateers, who received these appointments to captain vessels, and therefore still represented the same kind of authority figure that traditional captains did in the Navy and the merchant service. But in most cases, pirates elected their captains. As you can well imagine, an elected captain is far more concerned with the welfare of his crew than is someone who's appointed and who, in the case of a naval officer, is dealing with people who have been forced into this life on board a naval vessel. In addition to electing the captain, the crew also elected the quartermaster, the person who would essentially be second in command. And the quartermaster played a significant role because he was responsible for meting out any punishment that was due to someone, such as lashes, and pirates used that same kind of punishment on miscreants on their own vessels. In addition, he was responsible for dividing up shares of loot that were taken in the capture of a vessel or in a raid. And on top of that, the quartermaster would normally become the captain of any new vessel that was captured. In other words, you're on one vessel, a pirate vessel, you capture a second, or a merchant vessel, you want to make that part of your little fleet, so the quartermaster would often take over and become the captain of that second vessel. The quartermaster would also serve as a check upon the captain, since he had his own considerable authority. Furthermore, since the captain was elected, he could always be removed. In the worst cases, where someone was elected as captain but then proved to be abusive or incompetent, the captain would be killed. It's an easy way of getting rid of him. So, captains of pirate vessels in general realized that they needed to maintain a reasonable degree of support among their own crew. Obviously, they had to maintain discipline as well. They had to have people who would obey orders. But at the same time, they could not afford, in most cases, to push the crew very far because, of course, they were elected by the crew itself. Now, again, we have exceptions to this. Blackbeard, obviously, no one was going to try to unelect Blackbeard because, of course, he made it clear that he would kill anybody he felt like, in the blink of an eye. So there are exceptions to this, but most captains would fall into this category. Most pirate captains, particularly in the 18th century, would fall into this category of being elected to their position as pirate captains. In addition, the crewmen would usually maintain a council that made the major decisions in terms of what the ship and what the crew were going to do. In other words, are we going to sail to the west coast of Africa, or are we going to sail to the Spanish Main? How long are we going to stay in a particular area trying to find targets of opportunity? Are we going to raid a village, a society on land? How are we going to divide up the loot that we have? How we deal with major problems that may come up on board ship? These kinds of decisions were going to be made by the crews in regular meetings on board the ship. Again, a radically different environment than they had known on merchant and naval vessels. And indeed, in some ways, what pirates are doing is creating a society that is the opposite, sort of a mirror image of what they had come from. We have captains who are authoritarian, who can met out physical punishment anytime they want in the legitimate sector, shall we call it. But over in pirate ships, we elect our captains, and therefore they have to be wary of meting out extreme measures of physical punishment to the crew. Otherwise, they won't be around for very long. There were also codes of conduct that the councils would develop in terms of what behavior was acceptable on board ship among crew members, whether women, for example, could be on board ship. In most cases, the rules were against that, and we'll talk more about that issue of the role of women on pirate ships later on. But rules of that kind, of what the conduct of the crew was to be, and how problems were to be resolved. Often the quartermaster, again, was given the responsibility of resolving differences between crew members, what levels of punishment were to be meted out for various offenses, and this sort of thing. So the crew really did have considerable control over this vessel and over the sort of micro-society that existed on it. Now, inevitably, conflicts did arise, as in any human society, and I put two or more people in the same room for very long, you'll have conflicts at some stage. Well, certainly on pirate ships with crews that sometimes measured 150, 200, sometimes more, there were inevitably conflicts. One way of resolving them, as I suggested, was to have the quartermaster serve as a mediator to try to talk through problems. Another way was the system of shares, which was designed to reduce the major source of friction, and that was how much am I getting paid. And normally the setup was such that the council would decide that the captain will get a double share, the quartermaster may get a double share or 1.5 shares, and then usually the rest of the crew will get 1 share. So it is a relatively equal division of the spoils once a vessel is captured or a settlement is raided. And again, this is radically different from the kind of society they had in the Navy or on merchant ships, where they were paid a lowly wage, if they were paid anything, because many times they were told, well, look at, we didn't make any money on this mercantile venture, so you don't get paid. We don't have any money to pay members of the crew. So all you got out of it was the right to live miserably for a number of months on a merchant vessel. Here, it's a very different situation. And unlike other pirate ships, because there are exceptions to this, such as Drake's situation, where he's taking most of the wealth and then his crew are accepting simply minimal wages of some kind, here most of the wealth is being divided up among the crew members themselves. Another way of trying to maintain order was having an honor code, oaths of honor, in terms of how people would behave and that they would respect the rules of the vessel. And then this also became a basis, of course, on which punishment could be meted out, because it's kind of like swearing to an honor code at a university. Well, now you are subject to punishment because you already swore that you would not engage in this activity, and now you're engaging in it, so we have a basis on which we can legitimately punish you. So oaths of honor were designed, again, to commit people to a certain set of rules that they would feel compelled to obey, otherwise they would face certain sanctions. One of the sanctions that was often imposed was called Governor of the Island, which is not as awful appealing as it might appear at first. What it meant was you were being marooned, like Alexander Selkirk that we talked about on San Juan Island off the coast of Chile. Usually this was done to people who couldn't get along with their fellow crew members, who were sort of constant problems, getting in fights all the time, annoying other people, and who apparently were not going to modify their behavior. How extreme this was, as I think I mentioned before, depended upon the conditions of the marooning. In other words, were you left with some food, some ammunition, etc., and what type of island? Did it have water? Did it have game on it? But usually any type of marooning was reserved for people who just couldn't fit in, shall we say. They were social outcasts, or they were difficult in their behavior with other crew members. Selkirk's situation was a little bit different in that he had annoyed the captain, but not necessarily the crew. But in his case, it still led to his marooning. But most pirates got marooned because they couldn't get along with their crewmates. Another aspect of pirate society was what I call here the cry for vengeance. A belief among pirates that they were the ones who were being mistreated. As much as conventional society may look upon these people as criminals, their viewpoint was that they were in many cases victims. And you could understand this perspective given what we just talked about in terms of conditions for most people who were in the maritime or naval area. Given their treatment or their mistreatment, the miserable wages and living conditions, these people became pirates, no doubt in large measure. I mean, there's in all of them a desire for, to make some profit and make some money fast. But most of them are driven by miserable living conditions. They take up a life of crime largely because their life in civil society is so bad that they really see few alternatives to their own survival or to achieve any degree of contentment in their lives. They're going to have to turn to this way of life. So that when they are pursued by the Navy, by colonial governors as conditions change over time and political figures turn against them. They feel that they are the ones who have been wronged in this process, that we're only doing this because we have to. And yet you make us criminals, and you try to persecute us and punish us. And they turn upon these various authorities that they have faced over the years. One of their favorite targets was captains of vessels. In general, it didn't have to be a former captain of theirs, but let's say they capture a merchant vessel or a naval vessel, and one of the things they will quickly do is ask the crew, what kind of captain is this? How does he treat you? And if they get the wrong answers, that this is an abusive captain, this is someone who is cold and indifferent to his crew and mistreats them, etc., chances are the captain isn't going to survive this particular incident. And there were a number of cases in which pirates executed the captain and perhaps some of the senior officers on a vessel that they captured, and on the grounds that they had been mistreating the crew of their own ship. So this was a common theme in pirate society, the idea that these people are the ones who have been wronged and that they deserve vengeance to be visited upon, and they intend to visit it upon authority figures like naval captains. Sometimes the pirates would put bounties on the heads of officials, because again, this is a reversal of what's being done to them. Political officials in England or Spain or France, colonial officials in the New World and elsewhere, in China, etc., are putting bounties on their heads, that they'll pay a reward to have this pirate captain or his crew captured, etc. Well, the pirates reverse that and say the same thing about these officials, that if they are captured, they will pay a bounty for this person. And of course, the purpose is to get them into your hands and execute them. And this was not an idle threat because, of course, particularly for colonial officials, they did have to sail back and forth from the New World to Europe, and it would be not uncommon for a vessel to be waylaid by a pirate captain and his crew. And if you turned out to be an official who had a particularly bad reputation among pirates, your chances of surviving this particular incident were slim to none, even though you might not have done anything to this specific pirate, if in fact you have caused a policy to be implemented that annoys the pirates. They turn around and going to seek their vengeance on you by putting out this bounty, which other pirates will be anxious to collect. This quote here, "Curse the king and all the higher powers," is a quote from one of the pirate captains of the Spanish Main, and gives vent to a larger sense of outrage at civil society. It isn't just naval officers, it isn't just the captains of merchant vessels, it isn't just colonial officials who have put bounties on the heads of pirates or executed them. It's the whole process of what we would call legitimate society, the whole system that pirates often denounce, that they are in rebellion against all of this. And in many ways, we can see them as social rebels. Now, this is a long-standing debate on what constitutes a social bandit. Essentially, social bandits are considered to be people whose criminal activity, or what's defined in legitimate society as criminal activity, whose criminal activity is directed against the ruling classes in their own society. Robin Hood, steals from the rich to give to the poor. In general, bandits in the countryside who attack wealthy landowners. This kind of activity, which is consistently aimed not at one's own social group, but at the ruling elite in your society or your community, these people are seen as social bandits. That you're engaged, it's a criminal activity, but it also has a social purpose. You're rebelling against the existing hierarchy in your society by attacking the members of the elite. Pirates, at least in some cases, and we certainly can't say this universally, but certainly many pirates engaged in that kind of activity. In other words, they aimed their venom and they aimed their criminal activities at the ruling groups in their society. Was this universal? No. Secondly, were these people driven by a profit motive? Yes. They were in it for the money. But many of them also seem to have been in it as a form of social rebellion. This kind of quote that I'm giving you, the denouncing of captains of merchant vessels and in the Navy, all of this indicates this rebellion against the existing social order, and that pirates were engaged, on the one hand, in theft and criminal activities, but for many of them at least, it was also a way of venting their rage against a social system which had largely excluded them when it wasn't busy abusing them. Because as we've seen, most of these people come from desperately poor circumstances. They have never had a decent situation in life, the vast majority of them, so they see themselves as social outcasts, as the victims of society, and rebel against it. So pirate activity has more to it than simply the sort of romantic ventures of pirate captains, and it has more to it than the simple act of thievery on the high seas. At times, at least, it is also a reflection on what kind of society existed at this time, and one of the ways that people chose to rebel against it. In terms of vengeance, actual acts of vengeance were fairly numerous. For example, in 1717, a pirate vessel ran aground off the coast of New England. Most of the crew was drowned, but those that survived were taken and imprisoned in Boston. Now, it became a rumor among the pirate community that these pirates had been executed in Boston. And one of the people whose ears were reached by this rumor was Blackbeard. And he swore vengeance on anyone from Boston that he encountered on the high seas, and in fact he encountered a Boston merchant vessel and he sank the thing as an act of vengeance. Now, were they actually hung? Apparently not at the time, but nevertheless, it's one example of pirates seeking vengeance, and sometimes it isn't just against a specific authority figure, it's against anyone from a region where it is believed that pirates have been mistreated. So again, this common sense of vengeance, common sense of being the injured party in this environment, and using vengeance as a way of striking back against that system. Now, in addition to the values we've talked about, the kind of social structure that pirates had, we need to talk a little bit about what their material culture was like. What was it actually like to live as one of these people? We've seen bits and pieces of their material culture. I mean, the ships that they sailed on. In the case of the Mediterranean, the galley fleets, and in other words, ships with oars, and the Barbarossas and their use of that material culture in a very different way than its use by the European powers. In other words, the Barbarossas don't use slaves on their galleys. They use free Turks, and therefore gain a crew that is supportive of them rather than a crew of slaves who, of course, can't be trusted at all. Then we see in the Spanish Main, and in general in this period, in the West at least, in the 17th and 18th centuries, sloops, which are one-masted vessels. They were common ships being used by pirates at this time. Sometimes pirates would use schooners. Schooners are a bit larger. They're two-masted ships. And these vessels, as a rule, ran somewhere around 120, 130 feet in length. Now, their crews were around 150, but sometimes 200, sometimes as many as 250 or even 300 men. Now, if you think about a vessel that's maybe 150 feet long, you get as many as 300 men on it, which would be an unusually large crew, but sometimes they were that big. Conditions are crowded on these vessels. More crowded than they were on merchant vessels, because merchant vessels normally run with a much smaller crew. Merchant vessel would normally have about 30 people on it, even though it would be a sloop as well, about the same size vessel. Why? A merchant vessel is concerned mostly with profit. The more people you put on there as crew, the more people you'll have to pay, the less profit you get. Whereas a pirate vessel is operating essentially as a military vessel. In other words, they want to engage in offensive activities against other vessels, so they want a significant number of crewmen on board, because, again, the major way of seizing another vessel was not to blow it out of the water, because if you blow it out of the water, it's hard to get anything out of it. Then you got to go diving for the treasure or whatever you hope to get out of it. So the main thing is to try to disable the vessel with your cannon and then board the ship and overwhelm the crew. To do that, you want to have superiority in numbers. So as a result, pirate ships, as much as this was a somewhat better life than what they might have had in the merchant marine or in the Navy, nevertheless, oftentimes conditions were extremely crowded on pirate vessels because of this, of the need to keep a large number of crew members in order to engage in these attacks. We also saw the junks used by the Chinese pirates in the South China Sea. And like the galleys and like the sloops, the fact is these were essentially merchant vessels that were adapted for use in piratical activities. Pirates in the West or in Asia just didn't have the resources in most cases to go out and start building ships of their own, and ships that were specifically designed to serve as war vessels, shall we say, or as a vessel that would have a military aspect to them. They simply seized merchant vessels and then would modify the vessel, particularly by adding cannon and more weaponry to the vessel in order to make it useful as a pirate ship. Now, we talked a little bit about pirate treasure. We talked about William Kidd and his supposed treasure, which probably didn't exist, but which people have been searching for ever since. And there are all kinds of stories about pirate treasure, Oak Island off of New England, or off Newfoundland, I'm sorry, where treasure was supposedly buried down this deep hole and so forth. And on the Caribbean islands, all kinds of stories of hidden treasure. Probably not a lot of treasure was hidden that way. Sometimes pirates would hide some treasure temporarily if they knew that, for example, a naval vessel was in the area searching for them. They would bury some of the treasure temporarily until they were sure that they were clear of the naval vessel and then go back and get it. But the larger issue is how many pirate vessels ever captured significant treasure. And by that I mean silver, gold, silks, some type of high-value item that they could readily use to enrich themselves. Well, we've looked at cases like this and seen people like Drake who captured, a treasure that was enough to enrich him and 50 other people at the same time. Those are the rare cases. Most pirates were not going to strike it rich. They were not going to hit the big treasure vessel. Partly because treasure vessels, here we're talking specifically of the Spanish Main, are heavily protected most of the time, not always. But usually they have some kind of naval protection against attack by a pirate fleet. I mean, the Spanish aren't stupid. They know that those vessels carrying silver and gold are the most likely ones to be attacked by pirates, and they need to protect them. So at least some naval protection is usually available for the treasure ships. Secondly, there's the question of getting intelligence about the sailing of the treasure ships. Yes, you know that there are certain ports, for example, in the Spanish Main, where silver is being shipped out of. It's just Veracruz and Portobello most of the time. But still, when are they going? And what course are they steering? You're out there, you don't have radar, you can't, see over the horizon and find out where a ship might be. So just finding a likely target can be a challenge. And oftentimes, William Kidd got in trouble with his own crew, as we've seen when he was off the coast of India, because they weren't finding anything. They weren't, hitting any valuable vessels. And most likely of all is that the vessels that you will find are going to have cargoes, of course, but the question is, are they worth anything? The most common cargo coming out of the New World at this time in the 17th, 18th centuries consisted of cattle hides. That was the leading export by volume, not by value, of course, but by volume out of the New World, were cattle hides. Now, again, these do have value, and you can sell them someplace, but it's like hijacking a truck today. And you get the 18-wheeler off the side of the road, and you open it, and what have you got? Bathroom equipment, okay? Toilets, sinks. This isn't what you wanted. You didn't, hijack a truck so you could get a sink or a toilet out of it. You were looking for cigarettes, for stereos, for, computers, etc. Well, this in most cases is what pirates wound up with, was things like cattle hides. So the idea that pirates in general were prosperous and making a great living is generally not true. Still, for the average pirate, for the average crewman on a pirate vessel, they're still better off than they would have been on a merchant vessel or on a naval vessel in terms of their day-to-day life. But the idea that they are becoming fabulously wealthy, well, most of them would have been retiring if that were the case. But it's not easy to hit upon one of these treasure vessels. More often than not, you get something in between silver and cattle hides that may be valuable but isn't exactly going to make you a fortune overnight. So the economics of piracy are such that, yes, you can probably make a living at it, but you're probably, in most cases, not going to get rich at it. And this is why pirates stayed until they got caught in most instances. One of the ways that they tried to counter the problem of finding vessels that had valuable cargoes, because you might hit one of these, once in 5 years, once in 10 years, maybe never. To deal with this situation, that not only might you miss a treasure vessel, but you might not even hit upon a very valuable cargo from a merchant vessel other than actual treasure, one solution, as we've seen with Chinese pirates, but it also occurred in the West, was to sell protection. In other words, the local captain of the harbor is going to pay you not to attack vessels coming out of his particular port. Protection rackets were good, steady income. And it meant you didn't have to go sailing back and forth every day hoping to encounter some vessel either coming in or leaving port. You just went and collected your revenues. And of course, if the merchants or the captain of the port or whomever was paying the protection failed to cough up the required money, then you could make them pay by attacking the port or by attacking a vessel coming out of it. So protection was a good, steady income and remains so today among criminal groups. In addition to that, there was also ransom. This was another good one, although not as steady as, protection racket works well because it works day to day. It's a steady income. Ransom was good because, again, very often, more often than not, even when you got a decent-sized merchant vessel, the fact is it probably wasn't carrying a cargo that was terribly valuable. However, since this was the major means of transportation for people, and people who traveled at any regularity on the sea other than cruise tended to be the better off. It was expensive to travel. You were probably going to get a few people on board that had some money or from moneyed families, and you could ransom them. So this was another method, but again, not as reliable as the protection racket. It simply expanded your horizons, so you didn't have to rely simply on capturing a treasure of some kind. Now we're going to look at another aspect of material culture that has a lot of symbolic value, but also tells us a lot about the values of pirates themselves and pirate society. And Dan, our producer, has been kind enough to lend me a shirt that shows some of these pirate flags, and I'm going to show you another set in a minute when we look at a few of these. And on these, oh, good, we're great. You'll see the typical symbols used in the Jolly Roger, which was a pirate flag, in other words. This one, Emmanuel Wynne, is fairly classic in terms of it's got the skull and crossbones, or the death's head as it was also known. And this symbolizes an hourglass, in other words, time. And of course, you usually think of an hourglass in terms of sands through the hourglass of time, time running out. And this has important significance. This one here, Richard Worley, is just the simple, basic skull and crossbones that was most commonly used by pirates at this time. And we'll move this over a little bit. Again, you see one that's virtually the same, the skull and crossbones. This one, on the other hand, is a skeleton done in red. And again, the idea of death being central to these symbols. And then if we go down and look at Stede Bonnet, the gentleman pirate, and his case, very nice heart, obviously a man of great emotion. But basically, again, the skull and crossbones being central to it. This one with Blackbeard I'm always fascinated by because, of course, we don't think of him as someone with an artistic bent, but obviously he found someone who had certain artistic talents, because here you have a skeleton, which may symbolize actually the devil, given these prominent points at the top of the head, holding a drink, and he's got his spear here, and then we've got a heart and drops of blood, so a very dramatic kind of representation. Bartholomew Roberts, or Black Bart Roberts, he is a very elaborate instance of a Jolly Roger, with obviously the pirate and the skeleton with again the arrow, and obviously they're forming a community as they toast one another as they share that glass. If we go down and look at this one, Jack Rackham, this is one that, nowadays when you see people who put, pirate flags on anything, raider helmets or their motorcycles, etc. This one is most commonly used with the crossed swords and the skull. And this one over here, again from Roberts, this is the other one that he used. Here he's actually standing on two heads, and these acronyms down here are essentially threats to the people of two colonial islands in the Caribbean who he felt had mistreated pirates. So you get back into the theme of vengeance. I've got maybe a couple. Most of these are the same as you just saw. We'll look at a couple of other instances. Okay, if I keep moving, I'm going to mess him up. This one with Christopher Moody, again, you have the hourglass, the raised arm with the knife, and the skull and crossbones. And down here, another one, a similar one with the arm and the sword from Thomas Tew, another well-known pirate. But all of these Jolly Rogers carry basic themes, particularly death is a big one. Violence, with the swords, the blood, and the idea of a limited time on Earth. The time is running out for you. These are basic values in the pirate community. I mean, pirates are very conscious of the fact that most of them are not going to live long. I mean, even if you're on a pirate ship, you still face the same dangers of disease and storms, etc. But beyond that, you have usually people who are out to destroy your vessel or to find you and bring you to justice. So most pirates operate on the assumption that indeed their lives are not going to be very long, and at the same time that their lives, as long as they are pirates, are going to be marked by violence and death. So as much as these flags are kind of interesting dramatic symbols, classic symbols of piracy, they also carry a message about how pirates viewed their lives, their society, what was going to happen to them. And they had a pretty good idea on most of these values, exactly what was going to happen to them and what their life was going to be like. It was going to be short, it was going to be brutal. And at the same time, of course, it served another purpose, and that was as a threat to those whom they sought to attack, to try to discourage resistance. A reminder when you see that flag, of course, of the Jolly Roger and its various iterations is these people are violent, cruel, dangerous. They know that they may have to sacrifice their lives. They won't hesitate to do that. Do you really want to do the same thing as a merchant seaman to protect this cargo, most of whose value will go to the captain and the owner, etc.? Would you just soon give in and try to survive this? So it had a psychological purpose as well. Besides giving expression to the values of the pirates themselves, it also served as a psychological weapon to intimidate those who they sought to capture on the high seas. Now, as much as the flags are very striking, the fact is life on a day-to-day basis for pirates was difficult. It was a tremendous amount of manual labor, as would be true for crews of merchant and naval vessels as well. One of the major tasks that had to be carried out at this time was the careening of the vessel, which means dragging the vessel up onto the shore and tipping it, well, it would tip naturally anyways, but tipping to one side and then the other, so you could scrape barnacles and seaweed and whatever else had accumulated on there, and where necessary do caulking, filling in with tar, etc., to make the vessel seaworthy again. And this usually had to be done every few months. So this was something that was a regular occurrence and was extremely difficult, even backbreaking kinds of labor. Working the rigging and the sails was also difficult. Raising the sails or hoisting the sails was hard labor. There's not, at this time, of course, any kind of motorized equipment that'll help you do that. You have to do it all by hand. And, of course, it's dangerous working in the rigging of any ship at this time. There are no safety nets. The ship starts to lurch to one side, a boom starts to swing, and suddenly you're dropping 50, 60, 70 feet to the deck of the ship, and you're dead, you hope, before you hit the deck, but certainly by the time you do crash into it. So it's a dangerous kind of existence. On top of that, working the pumps. You may have seen this if you see stories of, sailing in the 18th century, etc. Essentially a turret-shaped wooden object on the main deck with holes into which they would insert wooden staves and then push on those in a circular motion as the crew move that pump to pump out water from below decks, because sooner or later the vessel would start filling up and you had to pump out the water on a fairly regular basis. And of course, in times of storms, you had to do it particularly fast, or otherwise you'd sink. So all of these were extremely demanding kinds of labor. That's why most crewmen were relatively young, their 20s and 30s. You didn't find a lot of old crewmen, maybe the cook and a couple of other people, but otherwise, once you were past your 30s, you really weren't fit for this kind of work because it was so demanding. Now there comes the question of what were these people eating? My quip here about how much is that doggy in the window isn't entirely a joke. There is basis, in fact, for this. The story comes from a pirate ship that was getting ready to celebrate Christmas. I'm sure they had a tree and all. In any case, they were looking for food for the feast, and they had been raising a pig from a little piglet up to a fairly substantial size, and that was going to be the main course. But the captain became concerned that that would not be sufficient food for an occasion like this, and so he sent a couple of his crewmen on shore, and they finally managed at a considerable price to buy a dog who was added to dinner, and was looked upon as a very happy addition to the meal. At least they were happy. I don't think the dog was. But the story says a lot about what the diet of pirate crews was. On the one hand, pirates did better than, again, the average crew member on a merchant vessel or a naval vessel, because, of course, they shared food equally. We talked about, again, an exception to this, somebody like Drake, who was an authoritarian pirate captain who ate off of silver plate and had the best food. This would be the kind of thing that would happen on naval and merchant vessels as well. But on most pirate vessels, food was shared up equally. I mean, the captain didn't get to eat any better than the crew. So on that basis, that they at least shared equally, they did better than their counterparts in the merchant marine and the Navy. On the other hand, it's not as if food was always readily available. First of all, you had to purchase food on shore, and this could be a problem depending upon, had you been successful recently in your piratical ventures, did you have any money to spend on food? Now you could say, well, see, if you don't have the money, you're a pirate. Wouldn't you just go on shore and attack the village? And yes, that was another option. But on the other hand, the fact is that in most cases, at least in regards to the Spanish Main and the Western Hemisphere, if you attack a small village, and most settlements were small villages of 100, 200 people, they're not going to have large stores of food unless you happen to strike right at the moment of harvest time or something. They're not going to have large stores of food. If you want to secure a large amount of food at one time, you're going to have to attack a substantial sized town or even a city. And if you do that, you're going to meet with some significant armed resistance. So acquiring food was in itself a problem. Storage and preservation of food was always a problem. If you're out chasing merchant vessels, looking for treasure, etc., you're often some distance from land where you can easily acquire food, and you often run out of food. There was a common problem of not having enough food on board, and the idea of taking leather strapping on the ship and cooking it, as we saw in the case of the British pirates in Panama, that wasn't an unusual behavior on the part of pirate crews in general when they ran out of food of other kinds. So, in general, pirates were better off because they shared what they had, and of course, when they were fortunate and attacked another vessel with a large supply of food, or had success in securing treasure of some kind, food would be bountiful and would be equally shared. But there were often long stretches where food was scarce or food was simply unavailable. And they often had to resort to the most basic of dietary habits in order to survive, eating all kinds of animals. If they were in the South Seas, they might grab some penguins, etc., etc. But they would eat basically anything to survive. So they're better off than their fellows in the legitimate naval business, shall we say. But on the other hand, they too go through periods of harsh deprivation when there is not enough food available. Now, leisure time activity. Every community and society has to have some time off. Here I say, does anybody like game of charades? Probably most pirates, as far as we know, didn't play charades. But they did have other activities, and we'll see, that were somewhat fanciful in their nature. But they did have a form of culture for their own entertainment. One form of entertainment was gambling. Gambling was very popular among pirates in general. There is a story of a group of Chinese pirates who were engaged in gambling on board their ship. While the ship was busy attacking a merchant vessel, there was an exchange of fire, and one of the crew members involved in the gambling had his head blown off. So his fellow gamblers got up, dragged his body to the side, and went on with the game. So it was a very common way of whiling away time on board ship. Music, with some very basic instruments, flutes, etc., would be played, and dancing among the crew was also very common, and they would sing various sea shanties, very much like crew members, because they had been at one time crew members on merchant vessels and naval vessels, singing about the women of a particular port, the danger of going through the Straits of Magellan on the southern tip of South America. These were typical songs of the sea at this time, about your experiences and the dangers of your life and people that you loved. Those are the kind of music that they would engage in. As far as drinking, this is a controversial topic, shall we say. Historians find interesting things to have controversies about. The issue is, were most pirates drunk most of the time? There is certainly evidence to suggest that pirates had a prodigious appetite for alcohol. I mentioned the story when we were talking about the Spanish Main of the attack on the coast of Venezuela that had to be canceled, actually, because crew members became drunk. Somebody dropped a lighted match or whatever down into the hold, and the ship blew up. There are a number of stories of this kind, and when we talked about Chinese pirates, of their habit of mixing gunpowder and wine as a sort of a kicker before they went into battle. And there are other stories of pirate crews being incredibly drunk during combat, or surrendering to a naval vessel because they were all drunk and were incapable of putting up any resistance. So there are those that argue that most pirates were drunk most of the time. However, that seems unlikely, despite the fact that, yes, they certainly engaged in considerable amount of drinking at times in their social life. And drinking in the 18th century was very common, far more pervasive then than it is now, although most of what was being drunk was not hard liquor. It was usually wine of some type, so it had a less corrosive effect on one's physiology. But the idea that pirates were literally falling down drunk most of the time is unlikely, simply for this reason. Again, you take the size of the vessels that they were sailing, really significantly sized crews that manned them, the need, at the very least, to have substantial armament and weaponry on board, and then even more space-consuming food and water, because when you're really hot and thirsty, you'd like a drink of water. With all of that needed to be stored below decks, the idea that you would store massive volumes of wine or rum on board the ship was just unlikely. I mean, they would certainly have it on board. Ships always carried this for the crews, whether they were merchant vessels or whatever. But the idea that they would keep large stocks on board, when in fact they often had trouble, having enough food on board, is very unlikely. What's more probable is that when they captured a vessel that had rum or wine, or when they were able to purchase amounts of this from a settlement on shore, then probably, yes, they'd have a blowout and everybody would get roaring drunk for a couple of days. But it seems unlikely that they spent most of their time doing that, because they just wouldn't have the space to store that much alcohol, and given the fact that they had problems anyways, just keeping a steady supply of food, that would be a larger issue, and suggested that they obviously would have difficulty maintaining large stores of alcohol at any one time. But drinking was certainly a common pastime, as it was in legitimate society as a whole, particularly among working class people. And having parties, of course, would be another. I'm sure they didn't have party hats or noisemakers, but except for people that they were torturing, who were called noisemakers. But they would engage in these kinds of social activities. Another favorite that was often practiced during these parties were show trials. And what show trials were was when the crew would get together and engage in make-believe. They would pretend that they had been captured by a naval vessel and were now on trial. And one crew member would get to play the judge, and one would play the prosecutor, and the crew members would be accused of various crimes, piracy, of course, rape of women, assaults on young children, and murder, etc., and then found guilty, and sentence would be pronounced upon them, all with the idea that this was a satirical attack on the legitimate society that wanted to destroy them. There's also certain black humor here, because many of them knew that, in fact, they would wind up just like that. They would wind up being put on trial and executed. In fact, at least in one case, a crewman in one of these show trials was found guilty of murder and sentenced to death, and the rest of the crew actually executed him. So they kind of took the joke a little too far. But show trials were a major source of entertainment for these people, as they sort of made fun of legitimate society, and it's an attempt to control them. Finally, in terms of pirate society as a whole, it certainly carried a wide variety of characteristics of human societies that we are familiar with, in terms of elected officials, shall we say, codes of conduct, penalties or punishments for specific kinds of activities, cultural symbols like flags that sort of embodied the values of this community. But at the same time, there was a lack of permanence, a lack of institutionalization in these societies. The closest we come to this, of having sort of a permanent or semi-permanent institutionalized side to pirate society, was, of course, the Confederation of Pirates in the South Sea. But even that was a business organization. It was one social institution, if you want, a business organization. But the other kinds of institutions, if you think of your own society, it has not only business institutions, it has religious institutions, it has educational institutions. A society that has a degree of permanence has certain institutions that carry out regular functions and reinforce certain ideas. That does not happen in pirate society. And furthermore, pirate societies, in fact, or pirate communities, operate largely in isolation. Yes, they meet each other, for example, out at sea, and they would often, cross over, and one crew would join the other for a party, etc., one of these fun show trials, etc. But generally, they operate in very small bands of 100 and 150. They have no place on Earth that they can really call their own. They'll stop in Port Royal, of course, but that's just to sell their goods, to have a good time for a few days, and then they're gone. So there is no permanent location. There are no long-term institutions which they share in common. So one of the frailties of pirate society was when it did come under attack, it really had no way to organize coherently in its own defense. I mean, what you had to do was go out and pick off the various pirate fleets or pirate vessels that were out there when the Royal Navy and the European navies decided to go after pirates. They don't have any means for common organization. They don't have a political institution that reaches beyond a single vessel or one small group of vessels in a single pirate captain's fleet. And as a result, they were singularly unable to respond to these attacks that were made upon them in the beginning of the 18th century. And we saw, of course, with the Chinese pirates, even their business organization had a certain fragility and inability to hold its members in place once some of them decide they'd be better off surrendering and taking amnesty from the government. Now, women pirates. We have to look at women pirates in two contexts, in both the West and in Asia, because the experiences are different. In the West, as I've said, there are very few women pirates in general. We may mention two cases, Mary Read, okay, and Anne Bonny. Why is this the case? Part of it was supposedly a tradition that said women were Jonahs. In other words, having a woman on board, any woman on board a ship, was a danger to the ship. And of course, it was based on the biblical tale of Jonah, who's swallowed by the whale. Of course, it's interesting that Jonah's a male. And now they're saying, well, yeah, but it's women that's dangerous to have on board the ship. The larger point here is that males were, essentially in the West at least, were excluding women from participation in sea life because there were jobs to be had, desperately needed jobs, because most of these people were desperately poor, as bad as the jobs were. So the real idea behind the story of Jonah is we don't want to share these job opportunities with the women. A second reality is that while women were not welcome on board the ships in the West at least, they participated widely in pirate life on shore. They owned taverns, they served as fencers for pirate goods that were brought on shore, prostitutes who were regular social companions of pirates. Women served a variety of roles, but in the West, their role on board ship was extremely limited. There are exceptional cases. One of them is an Irish pirate named Grace O'Malley, who is known as the Pirate Queen of Connaught. Her name actually in Gaelic translates as Bald Grace, because she shaved her hair when she was very young and kept it very short. She lived on the west coast, the northwest coast of Ireland in Connaught, and her father was a member of the Lords, shall we say. He was an Irish lord and a sea captain. One of the reasons they got into piracy is because the British were increasingly controlling Ireland, and the British would not allow the Irish to trade at the nearest British-controlled port, which was Galway. So not surprisingly, Anne got involved in piracy at an early age. As far as her social situation, it was one where her economic life was threatened by the British, both in terms of their attempts to limit the right of Irish lords to exercise what they called lordship of the sea. In other words, to engage in trade and, if necessary, in piratical activity. But the O'Malleys were going to move towards, and Grace would move towards piracy, in part because of this threat from the British in terms of their trade. In fact, she once saved her father's life. They had gone to trade with the Spanish, since the British didn't want to trade, and they were attacked by a British ship, and she saved her father's life in that attack. The other side of this was that as lords within Ireland, they faced the threat from the British that the British wanted them to accept British rule and in turn be given a British title to their land, which would make them hereditary lords. That was not the tradition in Ireland. In Ireland, the tradition was your clan, your family, chose the head of the clan or the lord. And here, if you accept what the British are offering, you become a hereditary lord, you become a large landowner, and you therefore come to dominate the extended family, something that most Irish lords were resisting. So Grace had another reason for her resistance beyond the growing British monopoly on trade in Ireland. As far as Grace's own personal life, it was a rather interesting one. She was married twice. Donald, her first husband, only survived for a few years before he was killed. She was supposed to inherit some of his lands. His family denied those to her, and that's when she turned to piracy on a large scale, and that involved attacking vessels at sea, but also selling protection, ransoming people, and that sort of thing. Her second husband was a man with the interesting name Iron Dick Burke. She was married to him for a year and living in her castle when they apparently had a falling out. Under Irish tradition at the time, you could get divorced simply by announcing to the other person that you were divorced, at least during the first year of marriage. So when Iron Dick left for a few days, she had her men close off the castle and throw Dick's goods out on the ground. When he arrived and asked to be readmitted, she yelled down, "You're no longer my husband." That was it. But they stayed together for another 17 years. They were obviously a strong personal relationship. During these years, she engaged in typical piratical activity, but also was involved in political uprisings, which are understandable given the fact that she was part of this Irish lordship system and found her legitimacy being threatened by the British, who want, of course, to have her and others like her declare that they accept British rule and therefore will become hereditary lords. She was involved in the County Mayo uprising in 1589. As a result, a British official later referred to her as that notable traitoress and nurse to all rebellions. She was considered a major thorn in the side of the British elite as they tried to suppress uprisings in Ireland at this time. In 1592, she had to face a counterattack on her castle by the British. At one point, she took the lead roofing off the castle, melted it into shot to use to fire at the British. But eventually, she was forced from her castle and, for a time, spent time as a poor farmer with virtually no resources. However, in 1601, she once again took to the sea and organized pirate ventures along the coast. What eventually happened to her is unclear in terms of her final destiny. Supposedly, at one point, she actually met with Queen Elizabeth. Whether this is a true apocryphal story is a little bit difficult to say. British historians tend to dismiss it. But she was certainly a striking character in the history of both Ireland, but more importantly, of piracy, because of the very large role that she played and the fact that she regularly commanded ships of 200 men or more in her piratical activities. But what again is striking in her case, and two others that we'll talk about in the second half, is this reality that she was an exception, that few women had the opportunities to engage in this kind of activity, to be in a situation to command a vessel, or to even participate in pirate activities on the sea, as much as they may have been playing roles at the periphery in terms of providing a means for selling pirate goods and serving as the owners of taverns, etc. But Grace is one of the striking cases of these women who were actively engaged in piracy in the 16th, 17th, and 18th centuries. In the second half today, we're going to come back and look at a couple more women and then look at the other issues about sexuality, about race, etc. within pirate communities and see how these factors contribute to our larger picture of pirates and their society in these early modern centuries. That'll be in the second half.